What would you do if...
Hello, and welcome to Creative by Konstantin, where we give you life hacks from music's best. Like and subscribe so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. And now I'm thrilled to introduce to you a world-renowned composer whose works are performed on major stages all over the globe by orchestras, ballet companies, and many important instrumentalists. And she is Polina Nazaykinskaya. And we're going to talk about being a composer and a multiple instrumentalist, writing music for different genres, and inspiration that is all over us, that creates completely brand new ways of thinking about music. Polina, welcome.
Hi, Konstantin. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you. The first question, of course, I have for you is that you began as an instrumentalist and you played more than one instrument and then segued into composition. Tell us, how did it happen?
So I couldn't choose when I was a little girl. You know, I liked so many instruments, and in particular, I loved piano, I loved flute, and I loved violin. And I went to a special music school where gifted children were granted an access to play more than one instrument seriously, professionally. So I had wonderful teachers in all three instruments. So it took me 7 years to finally decide that the violin was my favorite instrument. But along the way, I mastered all three of the instruments, and it definitely helps me now as a composer.
Do you remember the moment at which you knew you were a composer first and foremost, that switch?
I kind of felt like a composer from the very start. There's a legend among my family that I started composing very young as 2 years old. And I would always express myself, my thoughts, my emotions through improvisation on piano. So I kind of always felt like a composer, but of course, you know, being from a small town, we didn't have access to composition teacher at that time. So I had to become pretty decent on the violin, and then only then moved to Moscow. And I met my first composition teacher there. So basically, I became a composer more or less seriously at the age of 15 or 17, something like that, in my teens already.
Was your first piece for violin?
It was a duo, two violin duo.
Oh my God, two violin. When you said duo, I was expecting piano and a violin.
Oh, no. I played both parts myself. I recorded myself on a tape cassette, and I played along with myself, you know, to create a fun duo. That was a great experience, actually.
Wow. That's very interesting and unusual. Being a composer myself, of course, the first things I wrote were for piano, you know, so we're write what we know, right? Like
Absolutely.
writers.
Yes.
But then we quickly start branching out. Do you remember what was the first piece for an instrument you really didn't know how to play?
It was actually a song. I opened the book of one of my favorite poets, Alexander Blok, and I started reading poetry. And I just remember that the music started happening in my head right away while I was reading that poem. So my first serious piece was for soprano and piano.
Wow. Was it a single song or was it a couple of them?
It was a couple of them, actually. It was a cycle of 5 songs. And that piece got me into Yale, believe it or not. So I was incredibly lucky to record this piece with fantastic musicians, Maxim Emelianichev on piano, who is now world-renowned conductor, and Natalia Kirillova. She's a soloist of film, opera, and ballet. So she performed the solo part. And we recorded in Merzlikovskaya college, in Merzlikovskaya училище, for those who know what it is. It's a college under Moscow Conservatory. We recorded in a recording studio there. And that recording, I sent it to Yale, and it made a big fuss here because everybody loved Natasha's voice. She has this incredible voice, silver tone, very hip right now. I mean, it's kind of a zeitgeist to write for this type of singers, but in fact, I was kind of ahead of the curve 11 years ago.
Wonderful. That's a great story. So now, of course, then you made a leap to the United States, and you were already in your late teens. Am I correct?
Yes, the first time I got to the States, I was 20 years old, and I just turned 21 when I actually got accepted to Yale. So yeah, I was already at the legal age, 21.
For all the right things. Now, the question is, many people speak of cultural shock of living in the United States from pretty much any other country. Did you have a shocking experience, or was it seamless?
I moved from a small town to Moscow when I was 15 years old. And that was a bigger shock for me to move from a small town to Moscow than to move from Moscow to New Haven, Connecticut. Plus, I was just so happy to finally be a composer, to finally do what I really loved. So I didn't feel anything too bad. I really liked the school so much. I loved the teacher. So I was really focused on that and just being focused on my work. So I didn't have any time to be culturally shocked.
That's a great answer. In fact, no one should be concentrating on being culturally shocked. People should be concentrating on creating something and working. Now, was there a particular person who influenced you musically at an important moment in your life, at the juncture, like for instance, moving to the United States? Was it precipitated by someone that said something or did something that inspired you to make that move?
Actually, it was a very interesting story. It was my teacher, my composition teacher, whom I owe everything. He was such a fantastic teacher and person, and our lessons would last for 6 hours straight. I was incredibly lucky to meet him. But in fact, he inspired me, quote unquote, by telling that I don't have a future in the States. He said, don't even dare go there. You should stay here. And I felt like now I need to go. Now I need to go and prove him wrong. So that was kind of an unusual inspiration, quote unquote.
Well, that's a good piece of reverse psychology.
Absolutely.
And then of course, when you write, your music is so well constructed. So there is obviously a technique behind inspiration. Can you tell me what was your early professional composition lesson like, and what was the proportion of technique as a composer and just sort of playing around with sounds and imagination?
It's a great question. My teacher was really focused on analysis of music. So it wasn't so much that he would teach me how to write music, but every lesson we would look at pieces by Bach, by Beethoven, by Brahms, and analyze them through and through. So it was more like an analysis, actually. Every lesson I would bring a short piece, a prelude. So he was pretty demanding. So I had to write a new piece every week, which is, it's fast actually, completed piece. So we worked on the form. He was teaching me how to be self-critical. So he really didn't like when I would branch out from one idea to another. And, as a young composer, it's the easiest thing to do, to present an idea, a musical idea, and then to go immediately somewhere else because you don't really know how to develop that idea. In fact, I don't think that I can really develop anything now. I still have this inner fear that nothing is developed enough. So I go from one idea to another quite often. But I kind of learned how to like that feature of my music. In fact, in a ballet situation, this piece that I wrote, Nostalgia, there are a lot of different themes and different characters. Also, just basically juxtaposed side by side, no transitions whatsoever. But in certain genres, actually, that is an incredibly wonderful thing to do. So again, my lessons were more about analysis of music.
What was the role of improvisation?
It was up to me. I always improvised, and that was the most natural way for me to compose. My teacher wasn't a big fan of that, so I would not show him my improvisations. I would never improvise in front of him. I wasn't intimidated, of course. But back home, at home, I would go back home and improvise, and through improvisation, I would compose. Of course, I didn't tell him that. He thought that I was, really planning anything, but I really cannot plan. That's just not in my nature.
Well, I mean, maybe it's a question of just having an absolutely sort of bespoke experience with your teacher, when the teacher is wise and sensitive, and then they read you, and then they create the kind of lessons that are right for you, as opposed to one form fits all. Because mine were quite different, almost the opposite. I had to improvise. The lesson would begin, the compositional lesson would begin with an improvisation. And whether or not I felt like it, I mean, a lot of the time it was, I'm sure, pretty awful, but he wouldn't look at my music unless I've improvised.
That's wonderful, actually. Was it on a certain theme or on a certain mood?
It was either something he would make up, or like take a Bartok microcosm motive or something. I mean, it was, anyway, it was quite something now that I think about it. At the time, I really didn't enjoy it very much. And but it was just the only way to have a lesson. I mean, I would just be sent home otherwise. And then also it was all about economizing. I mean, it was a completely Beethoven-esque approach, like take 3 notes and make a symphony out of them. So I was forbidden to create too much material. I had to work with as little as possible, take the smallest seed and then grow it into, a forest.
That's fantastic.
Did you but it was very rigid.
Yeah.
It was very rigid.
Amazing.
Look,
amazing.
I mean, I liked it when it turned out nicely. Mm-hmm. And then I didn't like it very much when nothing was working and I still had to do it. Absolutely. Or like if I would think of a better idea and want to abandon what I began, and then my teacher would say, no, you may not write a new piece until you finish this one. So, basically you laid your bed and you made your bed, you have to lay in it, kind of approach. There was no wasted music, as it were.
My teacher had a nickname for when I would go from one idea to another. He called it Kudri Mudri, or curls, merls. Some curls. He hated it,
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Well, I wonder, at what point did you begin to look and study orchestration? Because that is a skill of its own.
I was so lucky in that regard that I grew up playing in a youth orchestra of Russia. So I was surrounded by orchestral music as a musician, as a player. And I was so fortunate to work with one of the greatest conductors of Russia, Anatoly Abramovich Levin, who influenced me tremendously. I didn't think of that as a composer just yet. I was just enjoying the incredible music that I got to play, Shostakovich symphonies, Brahms symphonies, so Tchaikovsky symphonies. So can you imagine being a teenage violinist playing all that great rap? But then later I realized that was my best learning experience as a composer later on. I just instantly knew how to write for orchestra with that kind of experience that I had. 13 years I played in orchestra, so it was very natural for me to start writing for it. Although with my teacher Konstantin Batashov in Moscow, I never looked at orchestration ever. So I came to Yale, and really my first lesson with my teacher, Christopher Theophanidis, fantastic American composer, was when I started writing my thesis piece. On my second year of Yale, we were granted the opportunity to write for orchestra. That was the first time we spoke about orchestration. But I felt like I knew what I was doing just because I played in orchestra for so many years. So I guess, for all of my now students, I advise if they can play a string instrument, they should go and sit in an orchestra and play. That's the best lessons in orchestration one could get.
What would be your recommendation to someone like me who only plays the piano?
Still go and sit at the rehearsals. You can play, some parts. Very rarely piano is used in orchestral rap, of course, but there are some pieces that do. But also just sitting on the rehearsals of the orchestra and watching the conductor, how the conductor, she or he, works with the orchestra. Just sit in the back. I feel like being present is the best school again, because learning orchestration by books is almost impossible. Another advice that I could give is try to orchestrate a little piece, by Chopin, a prelude by Chopin, and ask your friends to play it for you so you can hear it immediately. because computer realizations, they are not very accurate, especially when it comes to balance. I constantly do this mistake. I trust the MIDI so much. For instance, I can assign the woodwinds a melody and cover it with strings. It never works. I have to support the winds with something else in order it to be heard in a loud situation, a loud context. I've made this mistake so many times, and yet it's because of the MIDI. MIDI really projects the woodwinds so loudly, and in reality, it's just not the case. So I constantly have to remind myself, don't listen to the MIDI, just try to imagine how it would sound in a real situation.
Do you have a favorite orchestral sound, a composer whose orchestrations most speak to you or inspire you?
It's a great question. I have so many favorite, but in terms
Name
of
them all.
orchestrals, I would say Sibelius, John Sibelius. I love his orchestral sound. I just love it. It speaks so much, just directly to my heart. Partly because I grew up listening to his music. It's such a random composer to be in love when you're a kid, right? But that was just how it happened for me. So that's why I love it so much. But there's something so organic about his orchestration. I just love it. He never creates anything for the sake of originality. It's always comes from the essence of his music. And his music is always about nature, about this vastness. I just love the vastness of his sound. I know that you like quite different composers.
Oh no, I mean, I love Sibelius too. For me, it's probably Strauss and Mozart, because they're so different yet so similar in a sense of that transparency. Mozart's, of course, is like, looking into a diamond. It's just sort of perfect. And Strauss's, later Strauss, sort of from Der Rosenkavalier onwards, is basically the same but on steroids. is it's like looking into a Elizabeth Taylor diamond, right? It's like the size of your head, but it's the same clarity. It's complex and simple at the same time. Not taking anything away from extraordinary romantic orchestrations of Brahms and Wagner, sometimes they almost seem to be, on a verge of complicated. And I just think that brevity is the mother of genius.
Yes.
Now, for somebody who is aspiring to write an orchestral piece, but hasn't written it, what would you recommend as a stepping stone? Or is there? Or do you just say, okay, I'm just going to jump in and write for an orchestra?
So let's imagine a young composer who never played in an orchestra. So I think the first step would be to, well, for you, Kostya, you're already.
Yeah, I'm just saying. I mean, I've never played in an orchestra, and I haven't composed for the orchestra. I'm terrified.
But you know the rep, you know the literature, you know the pieces that are already written for orchestra. So I think the first step is to study Mozart symphonies, Haydn symphonies. Then we go on to Brahms symphonies. And we go on, and 20th century music such as Shostakovich symphonies, Prokofiev. Just study the music that's existing already. Study it, not just listen, but I would advise, my usual way of studying the music is to listen first and just imagine how it would be notated. Second thing, just look at the score without the music and then do it together. So listen and look at the score together. So in 3 steps, but you can of course skip one of those steps or all of them. Just listen with the score. That's the best school again. And just analyze, I call it treasure hunting. Mm-hmm. So look at if you hear something interesting, try to see it in the score and analyze how it was done. Right, what combination of instruments you liked the sound, and especially I have to mention this, Debussy's work, orchestral works, yes. Phenomenal orchestration. Maurice Ravel, orchestral works. That's just, in terms of orchestration, there's nothing more interesting or precious. You can learn so much from them.
And of course, Ravel was holding Mozart in the highest esteem. I wrote a paper on his piano concerti, and he was studying Mozart quartets while orchestrating the piano concerti, which he actually had written at the same time. People think that the left-hand concerto is composed way later because it's such a vastly different soundscape. They were written simultaneously and inspired by Mozart.
But I wonder what aspect of Mozart's music really inspired Ravel. This is an interesting psychological question, because in terms of orchestration, Ravel's orchestrations is just so much more expansive, you know, outwards, kind of almost extroverted.
Yeah. Well, it was the air. It's the air.
The air. I agree. And it's
the
hard to
air
explain.
within. Yeah. It's the distance between notes and how he hits the instruments, what gets doubled, you know. But there's a sense of like oxygenation of music, which, as opposed to, you know, rich, dense, but slightly suffocating sounds that you sometimes can get from, again, a large romantic orchestra of the turn of the century.
Yeah. It's a very interesting thought. You should write a paper on it. I love it.
I already have. I just found it
I
recently. found all my Juilliard papers as I was going through my library, because all the floppy disks are now obsolete, so they're gone. They were on floppy disks, but I found the actual graded papers that I kept that were printed out. So I reread them and relearned some of the things I didn't think about for years and years.
Wonderful.
Now, then, was there an instrument in your orchestral writing that you were challenged by and didn't know what the true capabilities are? And how did you approach, you know, dealing with that?
Well, yes, it was this first orchestral piece. The name of it is Winter Bells. So I wrote a huge harp part. And when I brought to my lesson, my teacher, Christian Fanidou, said, let's rewrite everything, because it was just not idiomatic. I didn't bother to look at the books, you know, on how to write for harp. So I just wrote as if it was a piano, and oh my God, I was wrong, you know. So definitely harp writing is very difficult if you don't play the instrument, but you can learn, you know, you can learn some principles and then go from there. In my case, I didn't, so I had to rewrite the entire part.
Well, you did very well, because this is one of your most performed symphonies worldwide. How many performances did it receive this season? Pre-pandemic.
Pre-pandemic. So this season was performed once by West Virginia Symphony, but on average it's 1 to 3 times a year, which is for a new piece, you know, new contemporary orchestral piece. Is quite lucky, I'd say. It's doing very well. So I'm very grateful, you know, that back then I wrote it and it happened. I had a very good recording. The first recording was made by Yale Philharmonia Orchestra, conducted by Farhad Khudiev. And that performance was just so beautiful. It was beautifully recorded as well. So the first recording of that piece was very important for me, because I started sending it out there to competitions, to orchestras, and that recording itself was just so impressive. Because of the level of playing, you know, and the quality of the recording. You know, we have to understand that for a youngish or young composer, building a portfolio is something crucial. So getting good recordings, getting good performances of your music is probably one of the most important things.
It sounds almost blasphemous to say that it's equally important, because music, you know, music is there everlasting. Performances are not. But looking back historically, so many of the first performances of great masterpieces that were botched and got better reviews. And look at Rachmaninoff. The disastrous performance of his first symphony plunged him into a depression that took years to deal with, and just nearly destroyed him. And it's a beautiful symphony, and I've heard it performed amazingly these days. But at the time, you know, it was just, I guess they didn't do a very good job. And that happened over and over and over again, you know?
Yes, this happened to me as well. You know, not every performance of my music was very successful, but partly because it wasn't notated well, you know, so there's so many factors that could play an important role.
When you compose, whatever genre it is, do you ever think, will it be easy to play? Or do you just concentrate on your inspiration and what you have to say as a composer?
I usually am just concentrated on the idea that I want to express, and only then I look at the playability. And sometimes it's too difficult. I need to reduce a number of notes and stuff. But when I write for an instrument, like a violin, I could kind of predict how it's going to be, for the instrumental. So it's very nice to be proficient in an instrument that you're writing.
Well, of course, because you can pick it up and just do it and play it yourself. I mean, I know when I have to write for violin, I call you.
Same with piano writing, but
you're playing piano quite well. But that's another thing.
Yeah. Let's talk about, so I started, saying that so many things can go wrong. The music can be notated poorly, it can be written poorly, or the performer just didn't get it, and so the role, what is in your opinion, as a multiple award-winning pianist who played so many new pieces, what is for you as a pianist, what's the key to the success of the new piece that was newly written?
I think it's a combination of, and just for full disclosure, I'll say that I love your music, and those who know us know that I play a lot of your music. I'm very grateful for it. But even before you and I met, which was about a decade ago, I find that the important key for new music to do well is for it to be performer friendly. It's to be beautiful and meaningful, but also something that the performers, are looking forward to performing, and so that it's somewhat manageable, memorizable. Like, I love to play from memory, and it is wonderful for me to be able to memorize, a lot of notes, but reasonably large number of notes. I have encountered music that is so complex that I just couldn't commit it to memory. I just couldn't get my brain around it. And that eventually results in fewer performances of the music. The music itself may be wonderful, but if it's so fiendishly difficult for performers and it requires hours and hours and hours of practicing, people don't play it as much.
I agree. And, I think that if the music is so complex and it's so difficult, there should be a good reason for it to be this way, right? If it's difficult for the sake of being difficult, then the performer could say, no, thank you, right? But if the composer,
Yeah, I didn't mean to please go ahead, finish.
No, but there should be this fine balance, right? We as composers should not feel that we need to make compromises with ourselves if we want to write something difficult. But we have to understand that if we write something difficult, we should really put all the work in, and we really mean it, because some composers really, they take for granted the incredible virtuosity of the players, and they would sometimes overcomplicate things. Myself included.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm really coming from a place of what I've said earlier, is that, and I speak with everyone on the show about piano competitions, which are such an important and large part of a pianist's coming of age in today's world. Most of the important competitions have a new music requirement, which is very important. I'm an advocate of new music. I think it is our moral obligation to play new music, because this is the music world in which we live. We can't just be custodians of the past. But by the same token, the commission pieces for these top competitions, assuming the incredible virtuosity and capacity of the pianists, I imagine, ask the composers to write a difficult piece that we then have no choice but to learn. And that is where I had experiences where I was nearly losing my mind. I mean, I literally had to withdraw from one competition simply because I couldn't get the piece done. And I wasn't going to go travel half across the globe assuming that I'm going to get kicked out of the first round. And in the second round, I would have to play a 20-minute piece or 15-minute piece. That was just, literally unlearnable to me. And I'm not too bad. Obviously, everybody else learned it, so I'm not saying it was unlearnable. Those who went and whoever won the awards, they've learned it. But I reached the limit of what I could do with my brain to get it done, and I withdrew. So those experiences, of course, lead me to think when I compose is how to not make it the simplest possible, but how to make it physically pleasurable for people to play. And that is what I find in your piano writing, is that I enjoy playing it. It's not easy, it's quite difficult, but there's nothing about it that feels laborious to the point that I'm kind of rolling my eyes and saying, oh my God, do I have to do this? You know, it does happen with some music.
Thank you, Kostya. Of course, you know, I'm so blessed with our friendship and our collaboration through the years, because I just love writing for you. And I'm so sorry that you went through this terrible experience, and I'm sorry for my colleagues, you know, who had to write those pieces. And I feel like it's a choice. Every composer should be very mindful of the performer. You know, I don't think that we need to make it so unplayable, then it becomes no pleasure whatsoever of playing this piece. So writing for you means so much to me, you know, and I every time I start writing, I just imagine your sound, I imagine your way of phrasing, and it gives me so much inspiration. So let's talk about how we met. Kostya, do you want to talk about that?
I know, of course, yes, we will. But that's the beauty of having a lasting relationship between a performer and a composer, because you know we get to know each other's music making, and if it's the right match, then hopefully it works both ways. You know, whatever it is that I do inspires you to write, and whatever you write inspires me to learn it and to play it and to continue to play it. I play your piece in every performance I give, one way or the other, whichever piece that is. But when we met at Haim, that was an amazing large-scale chamber music work that you were commissioned by Music in May Festival in Santa Cruz, California, and some decade ago, right? And the score, I mean, it's a mind-bogglingly incredible piece of music, but it's not very easy. And before I met you personally, and you were there, and I think that made all the difference, to have the composer there also establishes completely different scenario of a relationship, an ability to discuss music, an ability to work together, than if you just have the score and you have to guess things. And if you remember, there were some parts of the score I literally didn't know how to read, and you were there to show me what you meant, and it made perfect sense. But how did you think about using a credit card to create the sound effect that actually began to be my favorite sound effect? And once I realized how to do it and what it was, would you tell me more?
Of course. So there's several thoughts, you know. First of all, you know, how to meet your composer or your performer, you know. Going back a few thoughts before that, you know, I was just thinking, maybe some performers, they really love that super complicated music. They adore it. And then they're composers for that, right? So it's important for a composer to find their favorite performer or performers, you know, through their lives, and make friendships, meaningful friendships with musician friends. And I was blessed with our friendship, because you seem to get my music right away. So in terms of that notation, right? Notation, how to notate a scrape, like when you scrape the strings with the object. For those who know my music, it's not very characteristic of my music to use any extended technique. It's only just simple notes usually. But for that piece, I really felt like I needed to go inside the piano and use it to the fullest extent, meaning, you know, doing all sorts of weird noises inside the piano. So one of the sounds that kind of a prepared piano, semi-prepared, because we didn't put anything in the piano, right? But we had some
I did. If you remember, I used colors, sticky notes, to identify the strings. I was just chatting with Ursula Oppens and Jerry Lowenthal yesterday about it, because I couldn't think of any better way to identify notes. Of course, then Ursula said, "Why didn't you color code the dampers?" That made so much more sense, but it just didn't cross my mind. You know, in a blonde moment of mine, I just put the color coded stickers on the strings, of the ones I had to depress. But please continue. How did you think about that side effect?
The side effect. Extra effect.
Oh,
extra
special
means.
effects. Yeah, side effect. Special effects.
So
Apologies. Special effects.
I wanted to create the sound of I don't know. It's hard to describe. You know, imagine a thought inside your head that you don't want to be. You know, you don't want this thought to be in your head, and then it slowly starts to still cripple in, and you want to get rid of it, but it's there. So it's the sound of, you know, almost like physical. I don't know how to describe it. It's physical confrontation of what you want and what's happening. And a thought, you know, in your head is one example, but extra musical things, like if you hear something that appears to be a bomb and you don't want to hear it, you know, so you go into this denial and this sound of being, I don't want it to be there, but it's there. So that's the effect that I was going for. So I decided to use the credit card against the lowest strings of the piano, and slowly on a right pedal to create this, and then let go. So it creates this. I wish I had the piano here.
Well, but you know what I imagine. What I was imagining is the sound of broken metal. You know, when the war theater occurs, and of course there's this implication in the meaning in the story for the piece, which takes place during the World War II, of hearing a distant battle, right? So it's possibly that this disfigured metal, that the tanks and things, you know, blow each other up, and you get that sort of sound, but from the distance it acquires almost like a 3D depth and kind of dissipates into the air. I remember simply not being able to reach, because I'm medium, I'm not that tall. I couldn't reach for that string while holding the pedal down. I was like, how do I sort of bend myself around the piano and still look poised and, you know, elegant in the performance? Obviously, we're playing a very serious piece, so I didn't want to look comical or to create a physical comedy out of it, which almost felt like it might have been. Just holding the pedal down and reaching all the way there and then scratching. But
let's laugh, because you know how tall I am, right? I'm very tall. So for me,
well, you're taller than me, of course.
So for me, you know, I was doing this, no problem. But then remember, at one of the performances, you had to actually physically depress the dampers with your left hand and play without a pedal. Because every piano is so different, right? Sometimes you just cannot reach. It's built this way that
it was a 9-foot concert grand, which was larger than the piano we had for a premiere. And so when we did I think second or third performance, I couldn't even, like, my knee joint just wouldn't bend the other way. So I had to just walk over to the side, hold the dampers up and go. But I mean, I love doing it. It created such an arresting sound effect at just the right time, with just the right context. It wasn't at all gratuitous. It's just serendipitous that it was a credit card of all things that created it. Did you try other things before?
I don't remember. You know, any object would be fine. You know, you can even use your own nails to create this effect. So anything will do, really.
Well, you would have to be a superhero with like iron nails to do that, I think, or at least the with the intensity with which I did it. I would like to file my fingers off or something. Now, how was your experience having that piece performed? Because you were also conducting it. Have you conducted your own work before?
It's a good question. You know, in serious work, that was the first serious work that I conducted. I've conducted before, but the pieces for film and for cartoons and music theater pieces, so a little bit less in scope. So it was very first time, was my conducting debut. I didn't feel particularly great conducting it, but it felt like for the time being, it was a time saver for the ensemble, for me to conduct, you know, just keep altogether. But I think that this piece in particular is actually much better without a conductor, because in essence it's a chamber piece. So I like it better when it's not conducted. But that premiere was very important because the hero of the piece, David Arben, outstanding violinist, was there. David Arben played with conductors such as Ormandy, Furtwängler, the greatest conductors of the 20th century. So for me to be there and conduct that piece, it was so scary. He liked it, and he liked my conducting, which wasn't really good. I feel like he was just trying to encourage me. He liked the piece so much, and he said, "You're a good conductor." It was the best compliment.
I think, he did love it so much so that we, of course, performed it at the memorial service when he passed. And it's a piece that tells his story, how he survived encampment during the World War II and how music saved him. Of course, he went on to have an illustrious career and mentor generations of extraordinary violinists. Rebecca Jackson, who started music in May, is one of his mentees and an important student. And now, of course, she's written a book about him. It's an extraordinary story. I encourage everybody to look it up. Music in May Festival in Santa Cruz, California. But that was the beginning of our collaborative relationship. And of course, we've done a number of things and have a few projects in the oven. But I want to ask you, what is it like for you to write for ballet? Because you had written very successful, large-scale commission for Ryu Dance, and you have that I had the privilege of performing. You have written another one that will be premiered this fall, hopefully 2020, that's supposed to premiere now in April. That is just for solo piano and a ballet company. And you have other ballets that were premiered and performed in Russia at a most important dancing ballet reality competition on Russian national culture television. Tell us a little bit about that process.
I always wanted to write for dance. I remember being a little girl, I liked to jam dance with music by Metallica or Cream. I just had this physical impulse in me, not as a dancer, but I felt music physically. And, since that, I always wanted to write for dance. And my first piece was with Pascal Riou, fantastic, amazing, genius choreographer from France, who is now based in New York for so many years, and his company is phenomenal. So my very first piece was that piece that you're mentioning. So my biggest piece for ballet was my first one. And then it just happened that after Nostalgia, I had a few pieces back to back. So it feels like Nostalgia really opened that gate for me to start writing ballet music. And I was so incredibly lucky with my first ballet. How to write for ballet? It's a good question. I really don't know. It depends on your collaboration with the choreographer. It can be different. It is different for everyone. With Pascal, I had a true collaboration, where we would meet every 2 weeks in New York, and I would present him some musical material, and he would comment and ask me to enlarge this phrase or shorten this, or he would just listen and give me some images that went into his head when he was listening. He wasn't altering my music so much, just in a very few key moments, transitional moments especially. He needed some phrases longer, but overall he was just giving me the images, and the images helped me to progress with the piece. So I would say it depends a lot on the choreographer and the relationship between the composer and the choreographer.
Would you say there is, though, a technique specific to writing for dance, like the presence of a beat, or anything is danceable so long as the musical gesture is clear?
Well, it's a very good question, Kostya, and I cannot really answer that. For me, anything is danceable, because that's how I feel music. I feel the music in the very most physical way. And I see images, so images plus physicality means dance for me. So for me, any music that has those elements is danceable,
Well,
yeah.
I agree. No, I think there's no wrong or right answer to this, because the question is just there to make us think about it. to me, it just signifies the difference between modern dance and classical ballet, which we all know as delightful as Tchaikovsky's great ballets are, and the Giselles and and the Spartaks of the world. They're very they're just full of beats. There's never not a beat. It's very
right. It's very structured.
There's
structured.
because the classical ballet, the Russian ballet, demands it.
Absolutely, and because I never written a classical ballet, I can't really speak to that, right? But what I know is that 32 fouettes, you have to have 32 bars, so that's totally different than writing a modern piece, modern ballet piece.
Did you know that even the La Valse of Ravel was originally commissioned by Diaghilev, and he rejected it. He said it's a mayhem, it's not danceable. Off with you. And of course, it became the most famous orchestral piece that quickly got performed all over the world in a blockbuster, but in a subsequently choreographed, of course, in 20th century. I believe by Balanchine, but I may be wrong. So please don't send me hate mail if I'm wrong.
Pascal has a piece on La Valse, and it's phenomenal. Please all check it out. It's called Vienne. Choreography.
Well, because the scene that Ravel actually writes on the preface to the piece is that it takes place in Vienna.
Yes.
But it is the fact that it was rejected as an undanceable was a challenge to every choreographer of the 20th century to put it on. So I'm not surprised. It's almost like with you telling that you will have no future in the United States made you come here. So in many ways, Diaghilev did Ravel a great justice and just a wonderful thing for it, because it just began to be choreographed by so many choreographers. But with Nostalgia, there was a very interesting non-musical inspiration, even for its title. Would you tell us more?
Well, I love the feeling of nostalgia. Some people dislike it greatly, but we all experience it to some degree. I feel like everyone on this planet experienced this feeling of nostalgia, of longing for something that was so dear to you and it's no longer there. And I certainly experienced this, several times in my life. Moving from my hometown to Moscow, I experienced tremendous nostalgia for my hometown. It was unbearable, but through time, I learned how to enjoy this feeling, Sometimes I would even kind of provoke myself into feeling this way, just to be more creative. Because that feeling really... Yeah, absolutely.
No, you channel it into art. Take lemon and make diamond lemonade out of it.
Absolutely. So I guess this feeling was the most important inspiration, but Pascal loves Tarkovsky. And Tarkovsky has a fantastic film. It's called Nostalgia. So, of course, for Pascal, it was largely inspired by Tarkovsky's film, but I would say my music was mostly inspired by the feeling of nostalgia.
Right. And of course, for our viewers who don't know, Tarkovsky is one of Soviet Union's most important avant-garde nouveau filmmakers. And he made extraordinary films like Nostalgia and The Mirror and Solaris. Stalker. Yeah, so it's really, just amazing sort of, Bertolucci, Bergman type of a, cinema, not a movie. It's a cinema.
Yeah.
But it does really have those moments, even in choreography, certain body formations that Pascal created resembled certain frames from the film.
Yeah.
Highly recommend you to watch it. You can also find it on Vimeo, by the way. And of course, your next ballet is very, very different. Encounters.
Yes. After we met, Kostya, it was another dream of mine to write a ballet piece that would have a piano on the center stage and dancers dancing around the piano. So, and a pianist, you, Konstantin, being a part of the choreography. And we were so lucky to have this commission by MorDance New York, who seen our piece Nostalgia. And we met and we discussed this idea with Morgan, who's a founder of MorDance, and she liked the idea. And so in this piece, Encounters, the piano and pianist are incredible important part of the choreography. And I had the most fun time kind of imagining how it's going to look on stage, and creating this piece was fun, because we also went for this kind of uber minimalistic style that's present in my music sometimes, but not as much. So Encounters is probably the most minimalistic piece I've ever written. So it has a lot of repetition, but then from time to time it goes into super expressive, eclectic music. So I couldn't contain myself. I tried, it didn't happen. But there's a beauty in it. There's beauty in restraining and then letting go.
Of course, and it lends itself so well to movement, to dance. And it's so much fun for me when you were working on it. We were trying to determine just how much I can be pulled away from the piano while playing it, and how to liberate one hand so that it can sort of intertwine with the dancers while I'm playing with the others. So it's very experimental in many ways, yes, which makes it incredibly fun and gratifying for me to play. Now, I wanted to also ask you about choral music, because you've written choral work that has been just recently performed in the Bolshoi, on a grand stage of Moscow Conservatory, Bolshoi Hall. Tell us, how did that come about?
So, yes, it's a children's chorus based in Moscow. Their name is Aurora Children's Chorus. It's a phenomenal group. What I mean by that is that it's a regular music school in Moscow, in South Butova region of Moscow. So it's not a central music school. What I mean, it's a regular music school, but the conductor of this chorus, she's so phenomenal. She was able, in 10 years or so, she formed this group that's now touring worldwide. And they're commissioning composers to write for them. And it's 25 kids, ages 5 to 15, so it's very young musicians. Phenomenal ability to sing new music, any style. So my music is more or less very traditional, I'd say. But they've premiered some super avant-garde, difficult, extended techniques. And when I looked at them, their website and their recordings, I was like, wow, I should take this opportunity. The conductor of this course, Anastasia Belyeva, reached out to me on Facebook, and she said, we have this course, would you be interested in writing for us? And I looked them up and I said, yes, I am very interested. And then I started searching for the poem because I wanted to write on a contemporary poem. I reached out to some of my poet friends. Thankfully, I have a few very talented friends who are poets, professional poets. And I found a poem by a friend of mine, Ekaterina Lenina. The poem, I really loved it. It clicked with me because it was based on this image of gray wolf, the gray wolf from folk songs of Russian folk songs. The poem is very difficult. It's not conventional. The phrases are very long, but it also rhymes beautifully. So there are all the elements that I like: symbolism, connection to folk tradition of Russia. And also it is modern. It's not conventional. So I took this poem and I wrote this piece in 3 weeks. I was at the residency, iPark residency, and I took that time to really work on this choral piece. So the first edition is for just children's chorus. It's 3 treble voices and piano. It's the first edition. And then Anastasia also asked me to write two additional instruments into the score. It's a marimba and viola. And the reason why is that she got 2 superstar performers to participate in this particular concert. And she said, we have this fantastic performance. Can you please include them into the score? And I didn't have a choice. I said, yes, let's do it. So after the second edition is now with viola, marimba, piano, and chorus. And that recording, I have it on YouTube from Great Hall of Moscow Conservatory. But it's very hard to find, the performers. So now they've also did this piece so many times without those instruments. So it's only in the first edition. It's been performed more than in the second edition. But I'm glad that I did it because it was fun to work on the marimba part. I think I showed you my struggle with it. But I feel marimba and piano is such a beautiful combination of instruments. Plus viola is lovely. So it was in fact fun.
Yeah, no, it's true. And look, you're a great sport for doing it, because I think it's so much depends on composers' flexibility, you know, of being open-minded to these kinds of opportunities and changes in what you thought that particular performance or premiere might be, and it results in perhaps even greater music, and definitely, you know, a bigger impact on the performers, and gives your music, you know, subsequent performances more interest, for sure. And they did such a great job.
Yeah, it's phenomenal performance. But you know, as a composer, it is necessary to be flexible. Otherwise, what opportunities you'll get, you know, without this flexibility,
Right.
especially at the beginning of one's career, you have to say yes to so many things, you know, for free. You have to write for free for many years. And hopefully only then, when you have a decent portfolio, then you can start charging for your music. This piece, I didn't charge for it. You know, I still thought that writing it for free is fine, because this group is just so phenomenal. I knew that I will get a lot of performances, great performances. So it's more than money, you know. So and they're planning to perform it more and more. So it's kind of, it's there now.
That's fantastic. And of course, they did perform it so well. Now, very technical questions. I know that you love being diatonic as opposed to chromatic. Can you tell me why?
If I knew the answer to that question, it's just how I hear music, you know. Maybe because I grew up listening to folk music. Russian folk music is very diatonic in its essence. In fact, sometimes pentatonic. You know, only a few notes from the mode is used. You know, I'm studying a little bit of folk music right now, and some regions of Russia only use 4 notes out of the mode. And they create the whole piece based on those. But I can give you an example. So, you know, Sviridov uses this «Зеленый дубок, зеленый дубок». So, that's it. And the entire song is constructed on those. So, four pitches, but those pitches are very interesting because there's a tritone in it, right? So it's not simple, you know, only 4 notes, but so it's like a uber minimalism, you know, and somehow it's still incredibly interesting music that uses only 4 notes. So as I said, because of my upbringing, I think what I liked in my childhood still really informs how I write this.
Right. What is the genre you would dream to compose you haven't yet?
It's a good question. No, moving to the States, I thought that I would be in Hollywood, writing big Hollywood music. And I would really love to do that at some point, and to have the opportunity to write for a big feature film. That'd be amazing.
Oh, you would be fantastic for that.
Thank you. I hope that the opportunity presents itself. I really would love to do it. And some indie pop music. You know, so kind of 2 extremes, big orchestral Hollywood music and something that's very chamber, but very different. I love indie music. I only listen to indie pop. You know, I rarely listen to classical music. I love indie pop, and maybe writing something in that style would be very interesting.
Yeah, that's great. I think and it will absolutely come to fruition, no doubt about it. Now, what are your thoughts on the role of style in today's music world, in performances and just generally? Is that of essence? Is that a costume? Is that an extension of who you are, or is it a device behind which one has an opportunity to hide?
By style, you mean physical appearance?
Yes.
Because, you know, I keep thinking style, musical style.
Right, yeah, or we're pivoting, yes.
No, I love it. Well, you know, who hooked me on stylish things? It was you, of course, Konstantin. Because before that, I just didn't think about those things at all. I was just so preoccupied with, you know, trying to write more music, you know, get it performed. But then I saw you being so beautiful and stylish, and I thought, I love this man, how he looks, and he's so beautiful. And I started buying more stylish things. And I love dresses, you know, I have a bunch of dresses. I love going on stage, after the performance of my orchestral piece in a beautiful dress. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I kind of like the contrast, because my music is mostly very serious and grand, and then I appear, and thankfully, like I'm still rather, slim and youngish, so it's a nice contrast, because especially when I was, 10 years ago, every time I appeared on stage, people were like, oh, she wrote that. I like that. It's of course very childish, but that was a very nice contrast. But for me, it's important to look nice. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I know that there's a mentality, some post-Soviet or Soviet people, they can judge on how one looks, I think it's beautiful when a person really puts an effort into their look. They can express their thoughts, their musical thoughts, they can play on the contrast, as I mentioned, like Yuja Wang, for instance. She sometimes dresses extraordinary and she's a brave girl, to dress like that, to play so beautifully, and so virtuosically, and to play some serious music wearing a, say, red short dress. I like the contrast of that. There's something about it.
It's empowering.
And exactly. Plus, people who came to the concert, they're not there just to listen. They're also there to look and experience the whole, performance. So it's not only playing, it's also how we look. It's not the most important thing, I'd say, but the combination of two is what makes a difference. I don't think that you have to be necessarily slim, beautiful. That doesn't matter. Your presence and your charisma is the most important thing. You can wear anything you want, but if you mean it, if you put a thought into this, then it makes sense. You actually worked on it. I don't like when people just appear and whatever. It's kind of disrespectful towards the audience. So
well, I don't think whatever works because it's obvious, and then how could you command attention on stage under the guise of whatever?
Exactly.
I think it's authenticity is very important. So unless you're like, say, Lady Gaga, who makes a point of using fashion as a costume, as a guard between who she really is sometimes and her audience, and she does it masterfully, so it only brings people closer to her, but those are exceptional situations. Most of the time you have to be authentic, because if you're really looking like not yourself, if you're not dressing how you feel, then people sense it, and they just sense a certain degree of disconnection between what you look like and who you really are, and they can maybe even explain it, but they can feel it, and that alienates the audience. So I think it's important, but I don't think it's there's no absolute right or wrong. It just has to be thought out, and of course one has to have a certain degree of just reasonable grooming. And now look, right now we live also in the age which I happen to love and embrace, of live streaming concerts, of there's social media, people taking pictures. So I would say that it is for our own sakes that we have to pay slightly more attention to what we wear and how we look than 10 years ago, because guarantee is that we will be photographed and filmed, and it'll be all over the place. So unless you enjoy looking like a basket case, not advised, right? Well, I you see, maybe it's giving away my age, which is 39, by the way, was that I was sort of coming from a place of fighting against the notion that serious musicians have to look bad.
Yes, can you tell more? Because remember, I mentioned that there's a mentality of post-Soviet or Soviet people.
Right, but right now, you see, Russia right now in 2020 is a glamour place. Everybody looks really well. Everybody's wearing Gucci or authentic or not. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, everyone dresses up and glamorized to the utmost degree. I mean, we all know Russians have this reputation for deluxe stuff, but in the 90s and obviously the 80s, but I mean, in the 80s, I was a baby. But in the 90s, where I was a teenager, all my teachers, essentially told me, A, not ever to smile on stage because nobody wants to listen to Beethoven from a grinning idiot. And essentially that artists should never look too happy, too well fed, and too well dressed. We have to exhibit signs of wear and tear and tragedy, and then preferably some kind of personal drama to be therefore earning our place on stage to be sharing that with people. And it is, needless to say, profoundly upset me, and I couldn't disagree more. So I felt that I had to fight that with every fiber of my being, because it is just not true. One can be well fed and well dressed and be just as good an artist, but it just was not a zeitgeist of the time. So I went to the extremes of kind of shoving the opposite my point of view to everybody's face. So I ended up wearing, of course, bright red and peach suits and all sorts of shocking things in Moscow Conservatory. I think people still occasionally write to me on Facebook and they remember it's been 20 odd years. And
I love it, Kostya. You were the first one to start this nice trend of being yourself on stage, right?
But it began because when you're fighting against something, the extreme that results is an extreme version of yourself. I'm in fact not as garish as I then looked, but it is because I had to resist the prevalent mentality that made me go perhaps way beyond where I would have gone today, or living in today's world where you're essentially all bets are off. You wear whatever you want, right? I'm quite thrilled to see people all over the world, including Russia, dressed fabulously well, be that very formally or more in athleisure. I see people having tattoo art on their skin, which can be very becoming. And of course, at the time, you would have been considered, an arrested criminal if you had a tattoo. It was completely forbidden for a musician to even dream about it. And now we have, wonderfully successful people who have them. So times have changed. Mm-hmm. Now you're also a teacher, so you're already in your very young age influencing the next generation of composers. And I wonder how does that feel to be, in a way, so young and so recently a student yourself, and now you're teaching at a Brooklyn College of Music, and you have young adults that look up to you and idolize your music and hang on to your words and suggestions. Has it changed also your relationship with the process of composing?
Yes, I'm so extremely lucky to have the job at Brooklyn College, thanks to my incredible mentor, Tanya Leon, who believed in me. She believed that I could do this, so she helped me to get that job. And of course, it really influences me as a composer because my students are 18 years old, 20 years old, young people. They maybe 10 years younger than I am, but 10 years is a lot in this day and age because their culture is so different and so interesting. And I love seeing what they listen to. Sometimes they would show some of their favorite music to me, and it's so interesting, it's so different. And it's very new, it's very modern. I cannot explain what is new about it, but there's this freshness. And I could say that there's a culture of rock groups, kind of underground culture that I really love because one of my students, his name is David Hernandez, he has a rock group. It's only 3 people, guitar, bass, and drums. And they have their audience. You cannot believe, I saw some of the footage from their concerts. The audience goes nuts. And I love this, such a close collaboration between the musicians and the audience. I just love this aspect of his music. And of course, it really influences this music that he plays in his group, influences his classical music that he writes as a composer. He just wrote a string quartet that was phenomenal, that had that energy. just like from his rock music, but that was incredible to see that. And I only encourage this, I only encourage my students to be themselves, to truly embrace what they like in the music, because I'm not a big supporter of proper way of composing. I really feel like they can offer so much by bringing their favorite things into their own music. And I, to be honest, I treat my students as young colleagues, so we all learn from each other. It's not that I'm this big mentor to them. We really, it's all like a dialogue, between me and them. I'm incredibly lucky. My studio is fascinating. I have a student who is Mexican. He brings a lot of beautiful Mexican folk music, into his own works. And that's just fascinating to see how brave they are, how much they love music. And, my task is simple, just to show them some existing pieces that really might help them to, branch some of the ideas out, so we also look a lot at the existing music by Beethoven, by Bach. I had this fun Bach challenge on this quarantine, when the quarantine just started. We did a Bach challenge. We would record, me and 3 of my students would record an invention every day and upload it on a Dropbox. None of us are pianists, obviously. So it's, so it was just a learning experience, and they told me, we had the final lesson 2 days ago. They said how much they like that Bach challenge, and they want to do something more of that, nature, to look at the existing music, really, try it on the piano and on guitar.
Right.
Also, I teach at a school here in New Haven. It's called Educational Center for the Arts. And my students here are younger. So they are 15 years old to 18 years old. So very young teenagers, seniors, so high school.
Right.
And that's even more interesting because the culture, the music that they listen to is so different, so fresh. And I just enjoy listening to them, to their ideas. It's incredible. Really, I'm so lucky.
That's a two-way road always, isn't it? Absolutely. Now, is there a prerequisite that you sort of always incorporate into your teaching curriculum? Is there something that you feel very strongly needs to be taught or introduced as a concept?
It's not even a concept, but I want my students to be proactive. That's kind of a prerequisite in my studio. You have to want to write music. If you don't want to write music, then I don't see the point, Of course, as artists, we all go through phases, sometimes it's not so easy to write music, and sometimes we don't want to write music. And then this happened to me, to my students, you all, what this feeling is.
Right.
And it's fine. It's, you can call it a creative block or whatever, and it's important to experience that. But generally, generally you need to you need to want to write music. Generally, of course it can go in waves, but the desire of writing your own music is a prerequisite in my study.
So they have to be productive. I see, but you don't necessarily have like a requirements for a certain number of figure-based exercises or some theoretical Roman numeral analysis, or are those things assumed? Are they there, or is it varies from student to student?
It varies, of course. So if the student never looked at the figure base, I would not assign, right away. But I always analyze music from, harmonic standpoint, from a formal standpoint. I would say that I sometimes do some musicianship exercises with my students because I feel like it's so important to be fluent in reading the music, So I bring my Soviet books. I love Soviet solfeggio books, and we sing 2-voice exercises. It's simple, just 1 or 2 every lesson. Some people like it, some don't, but I kind of push it, because it really helped me to develop my ear.
Yeah.
So, musicianship, I'd say. Musicianship.
Yeah. Well, and to wrap it up, my favorite short question answers. What's your favorite book?
Oh, Unbearable Lightness of Being, Milan Kundera.
I know, isn't that nice? What would you say to a parent of a student?
Try to support your kid in no matter what he wants or she wants to do.
What would you say to a music teacher?
Try to see the essence of your student. Don't try to change him. Go with what's there.
What would you say to a student?
Work hard and be curious. Never don't be curious. Always seek for answers. Ask questions.
What would you say to yourself at 20?
Don't go to restaurants so often, save money. No, seriously, learn English better. Spend time reading. Study harder. I don't know. I was lazy a little bit.
Oh, I don't believe it. But no, the first one was good too. I think it's good advice to everyone that you know, restaurants are great, but we don't have to go as frequently as we do. And I think this current situation proves that it doesn't kill you to make yourself some chicken soup.
Or vegetarian in my case.
Yes, of course. Yes, look, thank you so much for spending an hour with me. And I just can't wait for what's to come.
Thank you, Kostya. It was my pleasure.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye.